Hello everyone, welcome back to the carnal and claustrophobic Comic Vault. I am Captain Logan.
And I'm Dan.
Hi Dan! Welcome back to the show. Today, Dan and I are going to tackle Kraven's Last Hunt, one of Dan's... Oh, you have a different cover than I do.
Yeah, this is the first trade printing Marvel ever did, so it's like one of those like old, wider trades and stuff like that, and
that's neat.
The Kraven on the front instead of the Spider-Man cover that you got.
So,
I like both of them, but...
When did they release that? Was it early 90s, or...?
I think it was 89, late
Oh,
80s.
wow.
Look at the copyright.
So. Okay, so it was shortly after this was published.
Yes.
Because this is 87.
I can look at the copyright real fast. Let me see.
Well, it's not that important, but I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, 1989. That's when it came out.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is one of, I'm sure, Dan's favorite Spider-Man stories, and
it is, yeah.
A book that I had not read until Dan turned me on to it a couple years ago, and I think I would count it as one of my favorite now as well, especially reading it a second time. Dan and I had planned to do a video on this quite a while back, and we both read it for it, and for whatever reason that didn't end up happening, so we finally are back tackling this thing, and I'm kind of glad that we waited in a way, because a second read, I think I picked up on a lot more stuff that will be interesting to talk about. The first point I want to make is a point that I could not have made 2 years ago, which is this reads a lot like if Spider-Man was a dark and brooding Netflix TV show. It's very Netflix Marvel TV, I think.
Yeah, you're not wrong about that. I think a lot of the Spider-Man comics in the 80s, when he had the black costume, especially this period after he gets the alien symbiote taken off and he wears the cloth version, specifically if you read like Peter David's run Spectacular and later when James Mattias takes over, they do have the kind of that dark tone, and I think it kind of works because they keep the characterization of Peter Parker consistent. He doesn't it's kind of like what you always say about Superman. You can tell a dark Superman story, but he's not a dark and brooding character.
Yeah.
I think in this story, Spider-Man gets to that place at some points, but the story gets him there, and it's very warranted because he gets buried alive and misses out on 2 weeks of his life while Kraven's going around and kind of ruining his reputation and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, Spider-Man's character arc here is kind of Captain America and Winter Soldier. It's pushing him as hard as we can to try to turn him into something he's not, and seeing if he can continue to hang on to his values and his belief in responsibility and all of that through this. And of course, he has a real difficult time doing that, and at times nearly manages to turn into something darker and scarier and more primal, which is kind of what this story is all about. And it's kind of what really resonated with me most with this is the idea that if someone keeps looking at you a certain way and keeps telling you that you are a particular way, it's very difficult not to accidentally start becoming that person. And Kraven is telling Spider-Man that he is this. It's kind of the animal totem thing in a way. That he is the spider. That he's a primal creature. That it's nature over nurture. He can't help himself, and Kraven is blaming him for some things that happened to his mother, I think, in the past, and because he thinks that Spider-Man is this has been like possessed by almost like a spider demon kind of thing, and someone keeps putting you in that box. It's very difficult not to accidentally start to turn into that, but especially because of what he forces Peter to go through in this story.
Yeah, and I think this story is one of my favorite Spider-Man stories because it takes a character where like the main sort of crux of what he's about is it's a superhero that is a human being first,
right?
And it asks the question sort of psychologically, what does it mean to be human? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of like Freudian psychology kind of stuff in here where like you have multiple thought boxes of the three principal characters in the story, and even Mary Jane too. So I guess the four of them, Vermin, Kraven, Spider-Man, and Mary Jane, where there's sort of conflicting, like you see their instinctual thoughts, which are like the id, and then you hear what they're, how they're trying to defy like their instinctual drives and stuff like that. And Kraven is this kind of character where he's sort of obsessed with this chivalric code, and he's nostalgic about the old world in the past where like there were, aristocrats and things like that. And he thinks that the world, by becoming less honorable in his view, is sort of deteriorated. And he thinks that Spider-Man is sort of a representation of people embracing that, their base instincts and not being civilized anymore, which is sort of ironic for a character like Kraven, who kind of like finds more honor in wild things than he does in what human civilization is, at least as he views it. I thought that all of that stuff's very interesting, and that's kind of what I latched onto in this story too. And Spider-Man ultimately comes down on the side of like you have to use a mix of both sides of the human character,
right.
There is a place for those instinctual drives like love and fear
especially.
Yeah. And him responding in a positive way to his fears ends up saving his life through a couple times in the book. But you also have to have a code like Kraven has, but you just can't be as rigid and obsessed about it and defy what some of your instincts tell you as well. It's a balancing act, which is kind of what Spider-Man's always about too, balancing the two sides of his, life and things like that as well.
Yeah, well, and the main problem with Kraven is that he doesn't understand humanity.
Right.
He says he finds more civilization in nature, which is, of course, an inherent contradiction. It doesn't actually make any sense. There's a grain of truth to a lot of the things he's saying, and sometimes it's hard for me not to want to replace words he's saying with other words. So when he says, he sees more like honor and integrity in nature, I feel like what he's really seeing is simplicity. He's seeing like a code of nature that has always worked for the natural world, but that breaks down when you start trying to apply it to the human condition, because we humans, for whatever reason, have something that separates us from the animals that clearly no other animal seems to have, and that's the thing he doesn't quite get. And so he has this almost like mystical way of looking at it, and that's when that's when his whole ideology starts to break down, I think.
Yeah, it does. It is inherently contradictory, and the interesting and tragic thing about Kraven as a character, and this is kind of the first time that Kraven becomes really a three-dimensional interesting villain for Spider-Man,
which is really interesting given what happens at the end.
Right, exactly. And this is the first time that kind of happens, and he was kind of just a joke before that. And I think DeMatteis, in his story, gives him a lot of depth and interesting things to say. The inherent, contradiction and simplicity thing that is tragic about him is you put Kraven in another time and place where aristocratic simplicity, where like the people who are the most powerful, the strongest, rule over everyone, like he was nostalgic for, where like what Russia was even before the communist revolution. Not that ended up being a good thing in the end, but Russia was it was a very destitute place for most of its people when the aristocrats were in power for a very long time, and that's kind of, I think, what he is nostalgic about in nature. You put him in a different time and place. I could see Kraven being like a noble knight working for a lord or something like that. He has the chivalry code, but he's just kind of like Captain America. He's like a man of time.
He would fit in
further back.
He would fit in great in Asgard.
Yeah, he would.
That's a culture he needs, kind of a warrior culture.
Yeah, so it's the tragic thing about him is that like if this guy existed in a different culture and understood humans a little bit more, that he could be a good person.
Yeah, and that's the key though, is that there's still in the understanding of humanity that he's lacking, and a question of his own sanity. DeMatteis and his writing is brilliant in this, such command of narrative. Yes. He is employing repetition throughout this with nearly every character in a really smart way. And one of the many phrases that keeps coming up with Kraven is "they thought my mother was insane," and I think insane is a word.
Yes, that is the word.
And I think every time he says that, there's kind of a question as to whether or not he's really talking about her or if he's really talking about himself.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised because, you know, I'm not sure. I can't recall if we get a bunch of stuff about his mother before because I haven't read every appearance of Kraven in the comics. But you know, that could be another aspect of his lineage because he does seem sort of obsessed with his family, and he feels like the world owes him something that was not given to him. Like he was born into an aristocratic family and wasn't rewarded for you know, being born into that sort of lifestyle. Like they had to flee to America, and he said they had to fester in this place where, you know, there was no sort of grandioseness to the culture like there was in aristocratic Russia, you know?
Yeah, a lot of stuff in this, of course, about the food chain.
Yes.
With rats and spiders, and we might end up getting into some of that, of course, when we get into talking more about vermin. But I feel like the like integrity and honor that Kraven is talking about that he thinks is inherently in nature is that like nature is fair. You know where you stand. This eats this and this eats this.
Yes.
And one of the things, and the big thing, of course, that separates Peter Parker from both of these characters is, as always, the responsibility thing. That's how DeMatteis makes this very much a Spider-Man story where nobody else could have been the protagonist of this story. Both Kraven and Vermin refuse to take any responsibility for their own actions. They're always blaming something else, and
yes.
And I think that's kind of where the food chain thing comes in a little bit, where Kraven's like, you know, if we were just in the wild, and things are more simple, as I was saying, I don't have to be accountable for anything. And of course, it's also much easier to you know blame this kind of like larger than life animal idea rather than seeing Peter Parker as a person. One big question I had was when Spider-Man comes back out, because we haven't even talked about his being buried alive and the trauma and the horror of that. When he comes back, and of course that's planned the whole time. He intentionally buries him alive, injects him with something, knows that he'll come back. I don't know how he has enough nourishment to stay alive that whole time. That's a question I have. I don't know how he survives even being asleep and kind of in sort of a stasis. I don't know how he doesn't need water for those 2 weeks.
Yeah, that doesn't really make sense.
But also when he that's the whole
and the fact
of the conversation we'll have about that.
He probably couldn't breathe under there and stuff too. Like, not that aspect of the plot. That's probably the biggest plot hole in it that doesn't make much sense.
Yeah.
But I was so engrossed in the rest of the story that I was thinking that, but I for the purposes of the narrative, I think that allegory is really effective. And that's
it is,
I liked about it.
and it almost, I'm almost buying the internal logic of the comic world to let that slide, I think. But those kinds of things are certainly case by case, and this is more or less a kind of realistic feeling story, and then you put a thing like that in it, and it's weird that I'm not questioning it more than I am, but that did come up. I don't even think I thought of it the first time I read it, but this time I was like, wait a minute, how does that work? But the actual real question I have for you, Dan, is when Spider-Man shows up, and Kraven's like, here he is, he immediately says, oh wait, I understand now, Spider-Man was always a man, a human being, and not just an animal. And I don't know where he's getting that from. I don't know how him showing up, Kraven suddenly has this revelation, when for years and years he thought they were more on the same playing field. I was really confused by that.
I think it was the way that Spider-Man was acting, because, like, when Kraven had confronted Spider-Man throughout their careers, like, you know, like, Spider-Man's, like, the jokey kind of character, you know, he's you know, cracking jokes and quips and stuff, like, even in his first conversation with Kraven here, where they invoke the cover of that Ditko drew of the first appearance where Spider-Man's trapped in the net, like, that was a callback to that thing.
Yeah.
Peter Parker's still joking when he has a rifle with Kraven when he has a rifle, you know, pointed at him, And I think once he comes out of the grave, Peter Parker is sort of just so angry and responding to his instinctual drives and urges. That's what Kraven understands. And he says, oh, like, this guy is actually human. Because he has those things. Like, Peter Parker puts up such a front when he's Spider-Man. Kraven, I feel like, perceives him as not as human as the rest of other people.
And that's the assumption I would have made if there had been a fight or a banter at all before he says it. But what's weird about it is Spider-Man's hanging upside down behind him, and then it's one panel. Like, he jumps down, and Spider-Man screams, Kraven, and then, in internal monologue, he says, oh, I see now! I understand in a way I never could before! This costume adventurer called Spider-Man is just that, a man. I don't understand that. It's one panel. It would have taken some time, I think.
Like, you can sense the tenor in his mood and stuff just from the way he's speaking.
Yeah, I get that. I didn't buy it. I needed more than that. I thought that was a little strange. But going back to what you were saying earlier about the costume, this story could only be told with the black costume. I think that's really interesting. And I like where it lands in Spider-Man's history, where he's feeling really bad about all the people that, and recently Ned Leeds has died. He's feeling really bad about all the people in his life that died, he says, prematurely because of him. So he's worried, not that he's becoming the animal, because he says right at the very beginning, I'm just Peter Parker. He makes a big deal out of the distinction between the identities, that the costume is just a thing that he puts on, and other people see it as an identity, but it is not who he is, especially in the way that Kraven is what he is. He's created that identity, and he is through and through what that is. It's kind of the difference between Spider-Man and Batman, but or certain versions of Batman where he thinks of himself as Batman, because they don't all do that, but some of them do that. But anyway, but the point I'm making is the black costume is really reflective in this particular history of how he feels about himself and how conflicted he is, and that we've got a guy who is having kind of a crisis of conscience, if not a crisis of identity. And then I really like that that Kraven puts the costume on and tries to turn it into what he perceived it as, and we immediately understand that it's not the same way. That it's not at all what he was looking at, but that you can understand why Peter is as conflicted as he is, and what that costume means at that point.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big advantage of letting Spider-Man grow as a character and get him older, because this story can only be told at this certain point in his life where he's seen so much and he's kind of world weary in the only way that a street level superhero kind of character can be, right? Like, he's seen people in his life pass away and things like that. Like, you can't tell this story with teenage Peter Parker necessarily, I don't think, at least in the same way. So I definitely like that about it, and I agree with you that the costume is not just reflective of the way he is in his life, but I think it's the only, this is the only this is the tone that costume is designed for.
Yeah, and he's intentionally using it to strike fear in the hearts of his criminals, of his foes. Like he wants to come off that way to a degree, but he still is very much the Peter Parker he always was when he was wearing the red and the blue.
Right, exactly. And I do like in here one of the just talking a little bit more about the way that you mentioned earlier, something that I thought was a really apt point, and I noticed too, about the DeMatteis's command of narrative and the kind of repetition of not just words but also imagery and the action and the specific actions of characters in this. Like, Kraven, Mary Jane, Vermin, and Spider-Man all exhibit the same sort of instinctual drives. Kraven tries to repress them, and Peter Parker does to a degree at the beginning as well. I think that's kind of the interesting parallel between the two characters, where at the end of the story, Kraven and Spider-Man both have a better understanding of who they are, and Peter Parker is able to use that part of his humanity to his advantage, and Kraven is kind of overwhelmed by it and needs to off himself because he can't take it.
I was going to say that's got to be the reason that he commits suicide by the end, is that he finds his own humanity and he can't face it.
Exactly. He finally looks at a clear reflection of himself, and he's horrified by what he sees.
Yeah.
Even though he won, which is a really haunting thing to think about. But I was even struck by some of the small scenes with Mary Jane, where she is taking her anger out that Peter hasn't. She's worried about him because she's thinking in the back of her mind, like, maybe he's dead. He hasn't shown up in a while, and she starts going to town on this rat on the floor. And Peter Parker does the same exact thing and uses the same words when he's fighting in the sewer.
I had forgotten what she was doing in that scene. Yeah.
Yeah. So like he intentionally, like, I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily foreshadowing, because like you see Vermin show up and like Spider-Man's going to have to confront him at some point, I suppose. But it's just sort of reflecting, like, there are things that all humans have in common, and there are scary things locked inside all of us, even in a character that's inherently a good person like Peter Parker. It's just a matter of using those instincts and drives in a way that you channel them in a positive way, rather than the way Kraven and Vermin do. Kraven doesn't really understand them, and Vermin is just sort of all drive because he's sort of hindered by what he is. He doesn't have the ability to make rational decisions. He's driven by, he's hungry, he smells something good, he goes after it. Like, he's been robbed of the ability to rationally use his ego or superego to decipher the world and things like that.
Yeah, and of course he's a really tragic and somewhat sympathetic villain in that he really isn't in control at all. There are places where he's blaming things he does on other people, but interestingly, not actually on the people that are responsible. He's like he was a science experiment, and there is someone to blame for that. But he's not actually looking at that. He's complaining about anything else he can kind of grab onto to deflect that responsibility, which is kind of interesting. It kind of made me wonder if he didn't even remember what exactly happened to him, because I don't know that background beyond what we're given here. By the way, this is set in a really specific place in the Marvel continuity, as obviously it would be, but it reads really well by itself, and you don't have to have read anything before or after it. But it's really continuous. I mean, it's keeping track of everything that's happened recently around it, and does a really good job of recapping without feeling like recap.
Yeah, the one thing that we don't really see here, which happened previously in DeMatteis's run on Spectacular, was the first time we're introduced to Vermin as a character. He's like an experiment. He's a guy that's experimented on by Baron Zemo, and they do mention that briefly in this book. And Spider-Man and Captain America team up to take him down. And you're right. He does have no recollection really of who he was before the experiment. He does have fleeting thoughts and thinks about it, but he doesn't have all of that knowledge at hand. And the interesting thing that you mentioned about Vermin, which I think makes his thematic place in this story very apt, and this is a character that needs to be in this story. He's not kind of a throwaway villain.
Yeah.
He's the representation of everything Kraven kind of wants people to be. He wants everyone to just sort of be ruled by the rules of nature. The strong survive and deserve to rule. And I think that's kind of Kraven wanting control over his life that he doesn't really have, because he's this failure of a supervillain who's always at the mercy of everyone else. And Vermin is a guy that's like what Kraven kind of wants to be, but has absolutely no control over his life at all. It's sort of a representation of why Kraven's philosophy doesn't work.
Yeah, because it turns out Kraven doesn't actually want to fully be the animal, because then he loses that control. I mean, even if he is the strongest, there's always something bigger on the food chain, obviously. But also, he's not fully acting just like an instinctive. Well, actually, he's not acting at all like he's driven just by instinct, even though he kind of pretends like he is, because he's got this master plan. He knew exactly what he was going to do all along, and he uses Vermin as a tool in his plan. That's not nature. That's not food chain. That's master manipulation, villain plot stuff.
Exactly, and that goes back to the inherent contradiction you were talking about. I mean, the only time Kraven acts like an instinctual animal is when he has the Spider-Man costume on.
That's right.
And that's kind of what he perceived the Spider-Man persona as we had talked about before. And
but that's just him putting on a character.
Exactly.
The whole time he says, "I am." It seems like he's trying to like psych himself out. He keeps saying, "I'm the spider. I'm the spider," and then he takes off the mask. He's like, "No, I'm Kraven." He's like, "No, but I'm the spider. I'm the spider. I'm Kraven." You know, like
yeah. And he even does that with himself when he's like doing the really creepy ritualistic scenes where he's like eating spiders and things like that.
Yeah.
He says, you know, "I am Kraven the man. I am Kraven the beast. I am Kraven. I'm Kravinoff the hunter." Like, he has all these different kind of like ways that he views himself, and he can't really reconcile all of them. He's a very damaged person psychologically, and that's what makes him really compelling and really interesting.
It's fascinating.
I would have never thought to do these kind of things with this character, but DeMatteis makes a whole psychological complex out of the way that, out of the theme of the character. I mean, Stanley and Steve Ditko just designed him as a like goofy hunting themed supervillain, and he made it into a psychosis. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy to see this material handled in this sophisticated of a way. Part of it, as you said, is because you never really thought of Kraven as much of a character before. But also, Vermin seems like such a C or D list nothing character, and he ends up being far more interesting than you thought he would be. I don't think it's an accident that DeMatteis, and I mean, that was probably a recent thing that had happened, but I think he's just taking advantage of it. And I don't know if he did that. I don't know if that happened in his run.
He did. He did, yes.
Then it makes me wonder if he was if he had the foresight, if he was planning ahead very much and knew that this was coming when he did that, because it does not read, and again, if this wasn't on purpose, he's just taking advantage of it. It doesn't read to me like an accident that it's Captain America that helped Spider-Man take him down. Captain America does not show up in this story. But I started thinking about that thematically, and I was like, well, you know, you have the embodiment of the perfect human specimen of compassion over compassion and reason over the over animalistic instinct, fighting with Spider-Man, and so then you end up with this triad where Spider-Man is like somewhere in the middle, and he's got to really, wrestle with his. And I'm sure in the back of his mind, Captain America does to some degree at some points too, but he's kind of, he's kind of got it figured out. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yes, you're right, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was planning ahead. Maybe it was just happy coincidence that it worked thematically, but like in that the Vermin origin story, like obviously because Zemo is the main architect of all that stuff. Like Captain America obviously would show up because Zemo's a big Captain America villain, and DeMatteis did write all that stuff. So yeah, I was reading one of the forewords. There's a forward and afterword in my version of the trade. One of them is written by Stan Lee, and the other one is written by. It's not anyone that worked on the book, I don't think, but it's someone that was working at Marvel at the time, maybe one of the editorial teams. And they were talking about how this story was originally just supposed to be in Spectacular, and they liked it so much that they ended up publishing it throughout the three books as a crossover, and it was all done at that point. So
I didn't know that's how it was published.
Yeah, it was. So you get into a little bit of the publication history of it, which is really interesting. I do want to talk a little bit about Mike Zeck now that we're talking about some of the.
Yep, that's just where I was about to go.
Yeah, Mike Zeck is not an artist I've seen do very much other work and things I've read. I know he did like the first Punisher miniseries, like the first solo series the Punisher ever got, and I'd like to read that at some point because I've never taken a look at it. But I love his artwork in this book. It's fantastic.
And especially panel layouts.
It adds so much to the story. Like, DeMatteis' writing is great, but I think Zeck is a match for him in every way possible.
Yeah.
This is a horrifying looking book. It's very atmospheric. It's very moody, dark. It's great.
This is one of those books that's really weird to go back to and then look at anything that is super wordy and thought balloon heavy and not really thinking about panel layouts in the early 90s, because this is 1987, and I don't mean that everything has to be this weighty, but it's really difficult to look at this and not say, why aren't comics done like this? And when you go back and you because we've been doing Spider-Man page by page, when you go back and you look at the Ditko stuff, he was doing that and then Stanley messed it up. There's so much of like really good visual storytelling going on in the early Spider-Man stuff, and really really eye-popping things that first catch your attention, and then is just moving you along in action scenes, and even in like a downtime scene where you don't need all of the words explaining to you what's going on the page, and then you get to this, and it's like we just took all the pointless thought balloons and stuff out of it, and of course there is a lot of internal monologue, and it needs it. This is a really poetic book, and then I mean, and like no accident that we've got the William Blake poem
yes.
with Spider instead of Tiger that bookends it. I think the internal monologue is intentionally kind of done that way, where this is really literary, and then it's also it's also really cinematic all at the same time. I can't help but wonder why we don't look at why we weren't looking at this kind of stuff more often, because it's in the late 80s, early 90s, because it's so easy to go back to things from that period and say, well, that's just how it was done then. Well, no, it's not necessarily. And obviously, this is not the only example of that. Dark Knight Returns is that way to some degree. There's plenty of stuff from this period, but this especially, there are entire pages with no dialogue whatsoever, and obviously Steranko was doing that as early as the 70s, but
right.
But anyway, I felt the need to point that out, that this is a really art-driven book. It's one of those books that you almost want to take all the words off of it and see how much of it you would get before you put the words back on it.
I wouldn't be surprised if you'd be able to get a good amount of it, because especially in some of the fight scenes where Kraven's in the costume, I think it's intentionally minimalistic, because that's kind of what the persona Kraven's trying to put on and stuff. Like, he's just like breaking people's necks, like slamming them up against walls and stuff. It's supposed to be very visceral, and there's no words required. Like, we don't need Kraven's internal monologue in those scenes, because
there are no words.
He wouldn't really even be having one. He's just kind of blindly, responding to an instinctual drive, and that's kind of what the story requires. So I agree with you. I think I couldn't have asked for a better pairing with these two. They really seem to have. I mean, I know that like a lot of these stories are done like the writer will email or send in the mail at this point, because it's the 80s scripts to the artists. But it really feels like these two people were in a room collaborating with each other.
And I was going to say,
good of a collaboration.
I would love to see the script for this, because I want to know how much DeMatteis let Zek kind of go his own way with what the panel layouts are going to look like, and
right.
Like I wonder if he told him exactly what he was supposed to draw or not.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. You always wonder with Marvel stuff how pervasive the Marvel method was in various periods and stuff. And 80s Marvel is my favorite period for the company. I think that's when every single book at Marvel had quality talent on it and were telling really great stories. And this is no exception. When a lot of people talk about like the 80s like big stories for like Batman Dark Knight Returns and stuff, I would call this like the Spider-Man version of that, but it doesn't get talked about as much. I don't know why. I think it certainly wasn't as influential as Dark Knight Returns, but I like this story about as much. I think it's great. Yeah, I think so too.
I feel like, at least for Spider-Man, it's really influential. I don't know that McFarlane does some of the stuff he does without this. I don't know if I'm right about that. I guess they were working around the same time.
They were, yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I've never seen a Spider-Man comic look this sort of like a horror movie.
Yeah.
Like, that's why when the trailers for like the first Amazing Spider-Man movie came out, and we were doing the kind of dark atmospheric thing, and the Lizard was kind of in the sewers and the shadows and stuff, like a lot of people were like, oh, that's not the tone that Spider-Man is. I was like, well, like it's not the classic tone that everyone thinks of when they think of Spider-Man, but I've seen it done that way, and I've seen it done very well.
Yeah, and I would argue, and importantly, it's not like this is the only time we ever get dark Spider-Man stories.
Right, exactly,
and you know, with the black costume and Venom, McFarlane was doing precisely this, like in the artwork, and with that, you know. Both the horror aesthetic and tone, and also the identity stuff, and Peter Parker kind of being afraid that he might kind of be the villain of the story despite his best efforts. At the beginning of this, I meant to mention this earlier, this kind of reads at first like it's Kraven's story and Spider-Man is his antagonist. Not that he's the bad guy, but just the POV. Spider-Man is his antagonist, and then that flips by the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the POV is really interesting, and he does another repetitious thing at the beginning where we sort of foreshadow what's going to happen with the story, where Kraven is, you know, sort of wrestling with stuffed animals, which is, when you think about it, is kind of hilarious. He's literally wrestling with stuffed animals, but it's really scary. But we see Kraven sort of walk up to the coffin that he'll eventually lay in at the end of the story and look at the...
Oh, they are stuffed animals!
Yeah.
I did not pick up on that. Yeah, because he knocks the head off of one.
Yeah, so we see Kraven sort of...
well, it's taxidermy, I would imagine, but yeah.
Yeah. So we see Kraven, like, you know, fondly look at the picture of his parents next to the coffin that he's going to lay in at the end of the story.
Yeah.
And then the perspective of the story immediately flips to Spider-Man at a funeral for a just random thug informant that he feels bad about that died. Like, it wasn't even his responsibility that the guy died. He just you know, passed away. And Spider-Man, like, for whatever reason, he's like, I feel like I shouldn't be compassionate about this person, but, you know, for some reason I do. And that's kind of where that question of what is it to be human begins. Like, Spider-Man has these feelings for his fellow man. He knows rationally that he shouldn't feel that way with this guy because he was just kind of a scumbag, but he can't help himself because there's something in the human condition where you see the suffering of another person, and if you're wired correctly, like most people are, then you feel compassion and sympathy for those people. Yeah, you know?
And Kraven has that too, but you can't see it because he's buried it so hard.
Exactly.
And by the end, I hadn't thought about that with the casket. So he ends up in the casket that he, or at least the grave that he buried Spider-Man in, and that's symbolic of his trying to become the thing that he actually turns out to be in the first place. He thinks Spider-Man is again the horrifying animal that he has to take down, and then he ends up in the place he put Spider-Man because he deserves to go there, and at least, you know, by the end, in his mind, he deserves to go there. So, like, the big identity thing, he puts on the Spider-Man costume, and it turns out that that's who he was the whole time. Not that he's Spider-Man, but that he's his interpretation of the Spider.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, like you were saying, at the very end, we begin the POV with the Kraven being the like you said, kind of the protagonist of the story, at least from the perspective that we get in his head, and he's talking about Spider-Man as his enemy and stuff. And at the very end, like, one of the last things he says, other than they said my mother was insane before he puts the rifle in his mouth, is, I have realized that every man has his spider, and maybe for him, I have been that. He realizes that that is exactly what he has become. That's
and it's your own worst enemy thing, which Spider-Man is also kind of wrestling with.
Exactly. So the parallels between the two characters become very pronounced by the end of the story, and I think that's, you know, all of Spider-Man's villains have always been kind of dark reflections of the path Peter Parker could have taken. And Kraven is like the psychological version of that. Like, if Peter Parker didn't have a correctly adjusted moral compass, this is what he could become, you know. And I think, you know, it's a very interesting thing to think about.
Well, also, if he kept, like, lashing out at the world for taking Uncle Ben, because that's exactly what Kraven is doing with his with what happened to his mother.
Yeah, and his whole family in general. Like, I think it's very interesting to take Peter Parker, who's kind of like a working, he came from like a blue-collar kind of American suburban family, and Kraven's like this aristocrat who was ripped from his life of luxury, and never got to really experience it in the way that his mother and father were so nostalgic about it. Peter Parker is a much more humble character just because of the background. That he was.
How much of that is upbringing? And so Kraven wants to see it as like, this is my nature. I can't help myself. But clearly he has a choice, and of course, again, that's what he figures out by the end. But how much of that is his upbringing versus just nature?
Yes, and I do like that you said the worst enemy thing with Kraven as well, because that is paralleled with Peter Parker, where he has that pseudo dreamscape kind of vision when he's coming out of the grave. He says that I am Peter Parker. That is my greatest strength and greatest weakness at the same time.
Right.
So they are in a lot of ways very similar, and
that's the human condition. Whenever you hear a villain say, your compassion is your weakness, well, yes, and it's also a strength. When fear is a weakness. Yes, but it's also a strength. It's interesting we keep talking about contradictions. These are contradictions inherent in the human condition, where both of these things are true.
Yeah, and I think the fear thing was a very interesting thing in the fight with Vermin to do, because, Spider-Man is a character with a power that is specifically fear-based. Like, his spider sense goes off when something bad is going to happen to him, and it's a reactive defensive mechanism. Like, he gets this fearful kind of tingling in his head that tells him you need to. It's like an animalistic drive. You need to flee, like the way that spiders appear to be able to flee when you swing a newspaper at them prematurely on the wall. That sort of thing.
Yeah, survival instinct. And then and then the question is, what do you do with that information? And that's what that's what makes you a rational human being versus just the instinctive animal side.
Exactly. So, I think all of that stuff is very profound in looking at this character through a different lens that I don't think very many people have thought about before, or have before or since. That's what I think is so interesting and unique about the story, and why I think, if you're a Spider-Man fan, you definitely need to read this.
This is one of the and maybe even if you're not, I think this is this is one of those stories that defines a character through a much different lens, where DeMatteis is proving all over this how much he gets this character, and you're seeing it through a really fresh and totally different lens than you've ever seen it before. And so people who like these kinds of stories, horror things, more disturbing kinds of comic book stories, suddenly would have something in Spider-Man, maybe a character they never cared about before, that they could really appreciate, and then maybe they would understand more of what the draw of that character is.
That's true. I would like to see, I don't know if someone like Steve has ever read this, but I'd like to see what his take on a story would be like this, because he's a guy that doesn't really like Spider-Man the same way that I don't really like Batman.
Right.
And
oh no, we know. We know.
I wonder if in this kind of lens and aesthetic, because he liked Batman, like the aesthetic of that, obviously, because it's dark, but he also likes psychological things. I wonder what his take on this would be, and whether or not that this clicked in him in a way that other Spider-Man things didn't.
And how he would feel about the arc. One of the most important, and we haven't talked about it really, moments in this is when Peter Parker says, "A part of me wants to kill you. It's a small part."
Yes.
And I'm not going to act on it, but it's there. And that's again that instinctive animalistic nature where you have these emotions that you can't help and you shouldn't help, and they're important. He says in one panel around there, I'm afraid and that's okay. You have to allow yourself to feel the way you do, and then make a decision based on that and rationality, not just to be completely to reactionary like Vermin is every time.
Yeah. No, that is one of the most important things, and we see Peter Parker using those sort of drives in in his everyday life, even when he's not Spider-Man 2, which I think is very important. That's why Mary Jane is pivotal to this story.
Yeah.
Because it shows the human instinctual drive to love and compassion, not in the honor-based sense that Kraven talks about, because he talks about like his family in a way where he loves his family because of the status that's attached to them, and it's sort of like he's nostalgic about a world that would have treated him better. Peter Parker really does care for his wife, and like the first thing he does, like, but he can't even speak to Mary Jane when he comes out of the grave because his voice is so like tapped from not being able to breathe. The first thing he does is embrace her, and it's heavily implied that they spend the night together in bed. But like it's not like distasteful or anything. It's just kind of like that's what people who love each other do, and it's a very tender and loving kind of scene. And you know that's one of the animalistic drives that people have that they act on, but you know, it also depends on how you use it, and I think that's one of the Amir Jane is obviously one of the most positive influences in his life,
and that's the thing he needs. Yeah, I mean, finding that that balance between the rational and the animal is a real sticky wicket.
Exactly.
Now to that scene you're talking about,
she's a complete knockout. Like if she wasn't a wonderful, well-rounded person, like a lot of men would be tempted, like some of them are in this story when they see her in her tight pants, those thugs, they try to, it's implied that they try to rape her and stuff like that.
Now, she's an idiot for going out looking like that. I just want to throw that out there. That was preposterous. I've never seen pants that tight. Yeah, Mary Jane, what were you thinking?
Yeah, so, a lot of men that don't know her would be tempted to do what Peter does with her, but because they connect to each other so well and they have such a positive influence on each other's lives, like that is the thing that's where the choice comes in. And like we've been talking about, all of these there is an instinctual basis for everything that humans do, but there is a choice in how you apply those.
And I love that instinct goes so far as to, she might actually have a little bit of a sixth sense that tells her that something has happened to him, which is something that couples that have been together a long time and have that deep connection tend to talk about a lot. That seems to be a thing.
I've seen that. Yeah,
that people really actually have. I don't think that's bunk. I think that is a thing that happens, and it's unexplainable. And DeMatteis doesn't take that too far. It doesn't feel magical or anything. It's real believable. And it also could be paranoia. It could just be he hasn't been around for a while, which I think is part of why it works. But I tend to think that it's that sixth sense that you have with someone that you have that kind of connection with. Something has happened to him.
Well, and especially given who Peter Parker is, like the situation we're in here is Mary Jane, when we first see her, is waiting for Peter Parker to help her move into his apartment. And given how responsible of a character Peter Parker is, she's worried that he's not following through on his word, and either he's tied up doing Spider-Man things, or something really bad has happened to him. Those are the only two options as to why he wouldn't show up. And she gets worried about him, like I think any wife would. And I think this story for me,
but it's as extreme as he's dead, and that's the part that makes me think that there's maybe a little bit of a sixth sense there.
Oh yeah, definitely. And importantly for this story with me, Mary Jane isn't in it a lot, but she's very pivotal, and I think this is one of the best examples of the Spider-Man Mary Jane marriage written well.
Yeah, absolutely. And she feels like a real three-dimensional character.
She does, and I mean, one of my favorite scenes with her in this story is when she goes to Joe Robertson's apartment because she's so worried about him about Peter at 1 a.m.
and can't tell him anything.
Yeah, she almost gives in to her instinctual drive and fear that she's worried about her husband. She thinks he's dead, and at the end, after like 10 minutes, she ends up walking out because she says to herself, like, even though Robbie Robertson is clearly a man of integrity the secret would be safe with him, I can't break Peter's trust with this secret that he has burdened me with.
Yeah, and I think it also implies, if I'm not mistaken, that she thinks he might even know already.
Yes, but and that's kind of a thing from the Spider-Man comics. Robbie Robertson always does have that wink and nod kind of thing, like Gordon does with
It's like
Batman.
Gordon, okay.
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why after Mary Jane leaves, the last we see of Joe Robertson is him with a paper on the coffee as Spider-Man goes on bizarre rampage through the city, like beating up, brutalizing criminals, and Robbie Robinson's just looking at it, kind of puzzled. Which you know,
yeah, because he knows who that is, probably.
Probably right. It's the kind of thing, and when she comes into his apartment, immediately he says, "Did something happen to Peter?"
Yep.
So
because he's already thinking something has happened. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So all like Mary Jane, she's used very sparingly in here, but she's also very pivotal to the story, and the relationship feels like this is something Peter Parker needs to keep going. Which I think a lot of people who talk about the marriage maybe haven't read stories like this. I don't know.
Yeah.
But this story can't be told without Mary Jane in the same way, I don't think. I really like her purpose in it. It's great.
No, and I think even that he's married might be kind of important just because we're seeing both the positive and the negative consequences to his responsible lifestyle. Right,
exactly. And also Mary Jane's choice to marry that man. Like, I mean, you know, Peter Parker's a person of great character and integrity, but like everyone has their flaws, and his is that like he can't always be there for her, and that's the one defining flaw in her relationship, the relationship she has with him, and she kind of just has to put up with it. She made that choice because she loves him so much, and I found that really really touching and sympathetic in this story.
Before we close, I want to talk a little bit more about the art, because I don't feel like we've dove into that nearly enough. I think the cinematic nature of this has everything to do with why you keep hearing people in Hollywood going to this as a thing that somebody might want to do. You know, as a movie. And the problem with adapting this, of course, first of all, I wish Marvel would take a page out of the DC animated direct-to-video movies and
this would make a spectacular
and do one of those. And I guess they've done a couple of those directly from comics, like Planet Hulk and things like that. But I would like to see them do something like what we did with Dark Knight and with Batman Year One, and directly adapt a thing almost panel for panel, which didn't work great in Year One, but I think would work perfectly with this. And just set it in exactly the period it's set in. Have it like just take it out, because this is again really easily just sit down and read. So just take it outright and put it in animation. If you did it in live action, it either has to be retooled real hard to work as an early Peter Parker story, which I submit can kind of be done, but it's a different story. Or you got to do it well down the line. Like I think it's kind of important that Kraven and Spider-Man have a history, if nothing else. I also want Peter Parker to be a more mature, grown-up guy before this happens to him. On the other hand, you could do something... If you wanted to introduce Kraven this way, and hear me out, because that sounds stupid, but if you wanted to do that, it's a totally different story, and I don't know that you would necessarily do the bury him alive thing, but you could have Kraven show up and look at him the same way he does at the very least, because he thinks that he's possessed by this, like primal nature creature, like he is here. Definitely. I kind of like the idea, and I almost think it would make a little bit more sense, actually, if, and there's not a big complaint with this, but like Kraven has fought him for years and heard all the banter and all of the jokes and quips and things, and seen how he behaves, and he still thinks this about him. It kind of makes more sense if he shows up and thinks it in the first place, just based on like newspaper clippings and stuff he's seen on the news and stuff.
Yeah, and that's to some degree. I mean, it's not Kraven in Ultimate isn't like this character at all. He's just kind of a goofy Australian like reality TV show star.
Really?
Yeah. What Bendis does with him is kind of disappointing, but it's funny. But he makes a big joke out of him. That's kind of how he comes into knowing Spider-Man in Ultimate. He's a attention hungry reality star that sees all these clippings about Spider-Man, and he goes to hunt him because he wants attention for himself and wants, he's the ultimate, prize of game. And that's kind of what happens in his first appearance when we get to that, which is the next issue after the one we just read for the Spider-Man page by page. Right. You'll see kind of how that works. But Yeah, I mean, you could definitely have this characterization of Kraven in a movie in a different time and place in Peter Parker's life. I just think it would be so unfortunate if you couldn't do some of the iconography from this. Like, the bury him alive thing is so... it's so breathtakingly, like, beautiful in a really twisted way in this book, the way it's drawn. Like, when he bursts out of the grave and is, like, holding on to the tombstone and stuff. I'd really like to see that happen in a movie
and it's the best. It's the best placement of the now, like really familiar hand coming out of the ground, you know, shredder thing. It's one of the best uses of that I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, like, can you imagine what the movie posters for the adaptation of this movie would look like?
Yeah,
it would be fantastic.
Here's my question: can you do the burying alive thing in an earlier Spider-Man story? And I don't mean even first, second, or third film, but could you do it in an early story where he's still at least like in college or something as like a major turning point, defining character moment for this character as opposed to something that happens to him much later in his career? Because if like a studio mandated this and I had to write that movie, that's what I would do with it. The big question is, would we buy that a younger kid that hasn't been through as much would come out of this the same way he does? Because I mean, he's taken to his absolute rock bottom lowest point and basically goes to hell and comes back. I think that's a hard sell for a younger Spider-Man.
I think so too. I think if I were to do it, I would set it. This would be the movie following the black costume saga in whatever degree they did it in the movies. Like, if you have Tom Holland Spider-Man and a couple movies in, you give him the black costume and you do that kind of stuff right, and then he gets it off and he's kind of... You leave him in a place where he's kind of already, like, distraught and sort of down in his demeanor and stuff, like he is at the beginning of the story when the guy is kind of when he's at the funeral with the guy and stuff. Like, if you leave him in a similar sort of place, even if the circumstances are different, I can see this story maybe working. I mean, obviously you'd still have to tweak a lot of things about it, but I think you could do something close to it, for sure. I mean, like you said, I don't want to say nothing can work unless, everything works and you just have to make it work, like you say. I think that's a truism,
Yeah, and of course, it would be like I said, kind of a tough thing to do early on. But I just thought of this. I think an argument could be made that because some people will say, well, you wouldn't want to do a story that dark. Especially in an MCU thing that's intended for kids to go see it. But we are doing the high school Peter Parker thing finally through an entire movie, not the first 30 minutes.
Right.
I would love to see Tom Holland's Spider-Man handled like Harry Potter, where it's supposed to grow up, where kids are supposed to grow up with it. So
I would love that. Yeah.
You do that 7 or 8 movies in, and then you've got, like, obviously, you've got us who grew up with Spider-Man already and we're adults, but you get like a 13, 14-year-old kid or younger that starts with this movie and it's maybe a little bit tamer, and then they get progressively more sophisticated and mature, and then you get the dark one, like 6 with Harry Potter. I think that'd be great.
That would be great. It would be very similar to Harry Potter in the film series and in the books in that way where he grows up, but that's even similar to the way Spider-Man was until the Clone Saga and after the fallout really until One More Day. That's kind of when we just kind of stopped.
Well, people did kind of grow up with this character, right? Where it does read as kind of a more teen fiction thing early on and gets more sophisticated as it goes along. Even through Stan Lee stuff. Right. I mean, I'm not saying you have to switch over after Stan Lee before it gets more sophisticated. I think that already was beginning to happen, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely does, as the book kind of hits its stride in that run. But yeah, I would really like to see Kraven done in a movie. There have been rumors for a long time that was one of the characters that Sony had wanted to put in a movie along with the Vulture. So now that we're finally getting the Vulture, I wouldn't be surprised we get Kraven eventually, because I think they're going to avoid, at least for the first couple Spider-Man movies, that Marvel does under their new, integrated Spider-Man. I think they're going to avoid doing something similar to the Sony movies at all costs, because that was one of the main criticisms of the last series, was they're kind of just doing the same story over again, which I don't necessarily agree with, but that was kind of the perception at large that kind of hampered the excitement for that series.
I still say they should do the 90s animated thing and do Hobgoblin first, and then...
I don't want to see that.
No, but, that was a joke.
Yeah, but interesting you bring up the 90s animated series and this characterization of Kraven. They do pull some lines and things like that from this story. In that, obviously they don't go as dark, because that show wouldn't ever approach this level of psychological sophistication.
Spider-Man, after he got buried alive, would show up and he'd be like, "You almost destroyed me!" And when Mary Jane, when we first see Mary Jane, she would have said, "Oh, Peter, is he ... She wants to say dead, but she's not allowed to say dead. That's what that episode would look like.
Yeah, there are like things that after reading the series, I went back to the 90s series and watched some of the episodes on like reruns and stuff, and I was like, wow, like there is an episode where they do the jungle drums thing pounding in his head that happens at the beginning of this. I think it's in one of the Kraven episodes after he gets hit with a dart, kind of like what happens here. So they do take some of those things and incorporate at least the perception of him being so tied to his Russian identity in that show. He talks a lot about like the old ways in Russia. I mean, he's like way over the top mustache rolling supervillain in that, but he's not as interesting as he is here. But this book has had influence in some of the other versions of the character. Not recent things, unfortunately. Like when we bring Kraven into like the Spectacular Spider-Man, he's not anything like this, because that's more based on like the early Stan Lee stuff more than anything else. But yeah, I'd really like to see Kraven get his due diligence on film at some point, because this story made Kraven into one of the best members of Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery by far. I mean, I think you would agree with that too,
yeah, and
right?
again, really ironic that he then kills himself at the end. And this is one of those things where you just don't ever want to see him again. There's nothing else to say with this character after this.
Yeah, and ironically enough, there is a weird sequel to this that DeMatteis did that's a one-shot where it's like Spider-Man going out with Kraven's ghost. It's not very good. I don't recommend that people read that. And then Dan Slott resurrected him. And,
Kraven's Last Haunting.
Yeah, and then Dan Slott and some of the other writers that were working on Amazing Spider-Man at the time brought Kraven back, and it was not great. And but I think the thing that this story did, which invokes a lot of the other classic Spider-Man villains like Dr. Octopus and Green Goblin, is it made Kraven one of those characters that you do a great story with him and he doesn't show up for hundreds of issues, and when he shows up, it's a big deal. Like with the Green Goblin,
yeah.
Like, whenever Norman Osborn shows up, it's like, oh my god, like things are about to hit the fan. And that was the kind of way it was when they brought Kraven back from the dead. I didn't ultimately like where they went with that story, but he's one of those characters now that's up there in the higher echelon of Spider-Man villains. Kraven is not saddled with the likes of the Shocker and some of those other B-list Spider-Man villains anymore after this story.
Yeah, but thanks to this, because otherwise he totally would be. Yeah, exactly. So I started all the and we're already almost in an hour. I started the Kraven movie would be cool discussion with, let's talk about the art some more. The big thing I wanted to mention is panel layouts, and especially toward the end, when I think my favorite art in this is when Spider-Man, besides the hallucinations when he's buried alive, but when he's crawling through the sewer and you have the side panels. So you have these side panels where he's crawling through the sewer, and then you have the big mid panel where he's remembering being in the casket and buried alive. I love that the panels are like claustrophobic panels that like that they're closing that bigger panel in. That is genius.
Yes, it is. The layouts in this, maybe it's just being a story of its time kind of thing. I was reminded a lot of the way Watchmen is laid out by Dave Gibbons in this, where it's very classic comic book, very defined panels. It's not like the panels like breaking out. It's not innovative in that way, but I think the way that the traditional panel layout and page layouts are used here is kind of like Watchmen in that, like, we use multiple panels to form a bigger picture sometimes, and it conveys the space around you, like you did said in the sewer, like it makes you feel claustrophobic and stuff. Like, there's a lot of innovative stuff within the tradition of old comic books done here that I really like. That's
a great point.
This is the kind of old.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say this is my favorite kind of panel layouts. I prefer more of the classic grid kind of layout here, more than the more experimental stuff that we get later. But what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
Well, and I think, and this might be stretching, going too far. I don't know if DeMantis is intending this, but I think it might be inherent on the page that the panels are simplistic, but what's done with them is complex, which reflects the human intellect versus animal themes maybe a little bit. But that could be a stretch. I don't know. One thing he does that is kind of that's kind of unusual, where it's not just the typical panel layouts, is he will have sometimes, and it always feels a little bit like strange and unnerving because it's out in limbo. He'll sometimes have between the spaces of panels artwork where something is going on that's not even on a panel. That's like in the white space. That's unconventional.
Yes, it is. You're right. So you're right. He does do a little bit more experimental stuff than I suppose I was giving him credit for. But you're mostly
right though. That's just the one thing that I was noticing again as I was flipping through this, where I was like, I better mention that because I haven't seen that a lot.
Oh yeah, definitely. And like you mentioned, the dreamscape stuff is just a masterclass of really scary imagery. Like, some of the things that stuck with me specifically, like when he's buried alive and we see Ned bleeds and Peter Parker is at first willing to think like, oh, Ned Leeds is alive and believe the illusion, and then he has to face the reality that he's dead, and Ned Leeds kind of collapses into a flaming pile of flesh in front of him through the panels. It's really creepy and haunting, and Peter Parker just kind of curls up into a fetal position in this just kind of white space. It's a really provocative set of panels and images, and whenever I reread this, that always just kind of sends a chill down my spine. It's really great stuff.
I also like how he intercuts between one lengthy scene in several panels to a single panel where something is happening somewhere else, and the main thing he does that with is the foot of the grave with the headstone, with the rat that is eating the spider, and then the spiders that all are coming up. And we'll occasionally jump back to that, in order to foreshadow things that are happening later, but also to suggest what happens in nature versus what will happen later, which is against nature. But that's really super cinematic. Like, you could imagine if this were a movie, what that would look like, and how we would just keep occasionally, cutting back to that. And again, that'd be like real unnerving and creepy, and you wouldn't want to keep having to look at that. But it just keeps jumping back to it to show you the next part of that sequence.
Oh yeah, my favorite instance in when they use that same device is at the end when Peter Parker crawls out of the grave, and we keep intercutting the image of Kraven taking the Spider-Man mask off as Peter realizes what's going on, and he's grinning, and he just keeps saying, "He's coming, he's coming," and he does it like 3 times. It builds the tension of the scene really, really well, and it's just kind of Kraven's face on one panel in a black background, and you just see the eyes slowly moving up to reveal his face, because you can't see like the mask defined. It's just an image of the eyes, and it just keeps slowly rising up to reveal his face. It's really effective.
We maybe should have done this in October. I could see putting this on a list of on like a top 10 or something of good graphic novels to read at Halloween time.
Oh, definitely, yeah, for sure. Whenever I'm in kind of a horror kind of mood, I want to read a Spider-Man story. This is what I go to, and some of Peter David stuff, because a lot of it's a completely different thing. But Peter David's Run of Spectacular has the same kind of tone. It's just more it's more influenced by like Frank Miller's Daredevil stuff. It's really gritty and street level. Like, he deals with like serial killers and stuff like that, rather than like the Kraven going off this. I mean, if you want to, at some point we should read some of that Peter David stuff because it's really good.
Absolutely,
I think you'd like it.
Something else. This is the last thing I'll say, and I should have brought this up early on. I've told you before, Dan, that when I was growing up and I first was exposed to Spider-Man, I thought he was supposed to be kind of a scarier kind of character, and that there wasn't a lighthearted guy inside of the costume. Part of the reason that I think this material is so appropriate for Spider-Man is because of just what he looks like, which kind of evokes the notion that Peter is like trapped in this world, that he's stuck with the spider motif. It's one of the few things that he wasn't able to control. Like so much of what happens, a lot of things are out of Peter Parker's control, but a lot of things that happen to him are because of choices he makes or consequences. I was thinking about this a lot reading this story, that his being bitten by the spider is one of the few things that had nothing to do whatsoever with the choice he made. That was completely random and came out of nowhere, right? And so he is stuck with this motif, and a lot of the time Spider-Man stories and Batman stories are like this too to some degree, but even more so, I'll forget the motif. Like Spider-Man's not a spider character, like he is with his powers and stuff, but you don't feel like you're reading a book that's about spiders and spider lore and stuff most of the time when you're reading Spider-Man, and this goes to those places, and I like the idea that Spider-Man is a scary-looking character because he's kind of trapped in that world, but he's not actually that guy.
Yeah, exactly, and I was thinking the same thing, because spiders are inherently a thing that people are afraid of.
Yeah.
And always have been. So it's interesting...
And Peter Parker is the least imposing person on the planet.
Right, exactly. Which is the ironic thing about the motif that he has, which is really interesting. And I think it's very one of my favorite images that in the story that made me kind of think about that is when Peter Parker, before he has the visions, it's at the very beginning of the story. We just see him kind of relaxing and going to bed, and he sees a spider on his wall, and he considers smushing it, but he thinks to himself, and there's no dialogue here. He just scratches his chin and then shuts the light off. And then after he has the vision, he wakes up and he's in a cold sweat, and he kills the spider on the wall because he's afraid.
Mm-hmm. It's good stuff. Anything else you wanted to make sure and bring up before we bid everybody adieu today?
I don't think so. I would just implore people to really, check this out. Marvel has been, for a long time, this story wasn't reprinted. I think the edition you have is the most recent reprint of it, and it's been kept in print ever since, so they're kind of good about collecting it now. This trade I had was kind of rare. I had some trouble finding it, and eventually found it at a comic shop sort of near me, but I had to kind of hunt it down. I also don't think the issues are very expensive, because it's late 80s Marvel stuff.
That's Dan's last hunt. He finally found it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's only 6 issues long, so it's kind of... I think you'd want to spend more time looking at this than your usual 6-issue comic book, because it's so dynamic in the artwork, and there's a lot of visual storytelling that we talked about, and just symbolism and foreshadowing. This is definitely one that I've read this story upwards, I think, of like 15 times before. I always notice something new in the artwork every time I read it. So I think this is one, if you have like a long afternoon, it's rainy outside, it's kind of dark, there's stormy clouds in the sky.
Yeah.
Like this is a perfect kind of book for one of those kind of days, and I'd say spend a long time with it. Yeah, I mean, it's just really, really wonderful. And if you guys like this story, DeMatteis did a whole run on Spectacular that's really great. There's a whole thing with Harry Osborn as the Green Goblin. That's when DeMatteis gets to kill Harry Osborn. That's the death of him. And there's all the hallucinations from the Spider-Man movies with Norman Osborn, Harry seeing him in mirrors and stuff comes from that run. And it's really
cool.
Great.
I have a lot of that, and I've never read it.
Yeah, at some point if you want to review it, we should, because that's one of my favorite runs on Spider-Man. It's great, and I always try to, like, when we review Spider-Man things, tell people other things to read, because I think like Superman, Spider-Man's one of those characters where people don't know where to start because it's so continuous.
Yeah.
And a lot of I don't think Spider-Man has the same problem as Superman, where a lot of the stories are sort of outdated or aren't worth reading anymore. It's just a matter of where to jump in. So I always try to give people advice on that sort of thing. So anything DeMatteis writes, I would implore people to check it out, but this especially, it's a really great story.
Well, everybody, thanks as always for watching. We sure appreciate it, and we'll see you again this week with lots more videos here on Geekvolution. Dan, thanks as always for being on the show and doing more Spider-Man stuff with me.
Thanks for going back to this. It was a pleasure to reread again. I love this.
Yeah, this was one we really needed to get to, so I'm glad we have finally gotten that out.
Yeah.
Dan and I will be with you again next week on The Vault. We have not decided yet what we're going to review, but we will do something for you. Might be Spider-Man, might be Star Wars, might be something else. Don't know yet. But anyway, thanks again for watching. I am Captain Logan.
And I'm Dan.
And we'll see you next time.